technology event. We have Beth Gaskell here with us from the British Library to talk about managing national collections. So in a minute, I'll pass the floor to her, and then when she's done, we'll have ample time to ask her all of our questions and have a great discussion. So if you're just coming in, you'll feel free to say hi in the chat and maybe say where you're watching from or joining us from. But Beth, if you'd like to take us away, we're also excited to hear your talk.
Let me get my slides. Just let me know when you can see them.
All right, I will. It shows that it's loading for me, but I think it will come on any second. All right, they are loud and clear for us.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to be looking back and forth between a couple of screens while I do this. So, yeah, trying to juggle several different things that I'm looking at. So, hi, my name's Beth Gaskell, and I am Lead Curator of News and Moving Image at the British Library. I've worked at the library now for just over 8 years, and this is my third role. So I came in on a project. I then worked as curator of newspaper collections, and now I'm the lead curator that oversees a section that includes newspapers, but also radio and moving image. And I also have some responsibility for sort of overseeing what's going on with the web news. So it's quite a wide-ranging role. I came to this via quite a long route. I've worked in libraries for a long time, in various special libraries, museum libraries. I even worked in a school library for a little bit. But then I decided to do my PhD and was looking at 19th century newspapers. And then the role came up at the British Library looking for somebody who specialised in 19th century newspapers and had library experience and qualifications, and so it seemed like the perfect fit. And the rest is history. It's been a sort of strange time. I've also had 2 children, finished my PhD. It's been a very strange time working there, but it has been wonderful, and it in general is a really, really wonderful place to work. So I'm going to break this talk down into 4 hopefully quite short sections. I'm going to talk about the collection. I'm going to talk about what my job involves. I'm going to talk a bit about preservation, and I'm going to talk about digitization. So, are my slides going to change? Okay, here we go.
Oh, so sorry, Beth. They have not. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I spoke too soon. Apologize for breaking your flow.
Okay, hopefully they'll speed up a bit as we go along. Well, let me know if they're not changing quickly. I don't want to be talking to a slide that's not up. Okay, so the earliest newspaper in the collection is from 1621, and the most recent was published in the last few days, depending on how long it takes for the legal deposit newspapers to arrive at the library. I am responsible mostly for looking after British and Irish newspapers from the 18th century onwards. The bulk of my collection is from after 1800. Some newspapers sit with our printed heritage department, and all periodicals sit with the printed heritage department. There's quite a complicated definition argument around how we've defined newspapers and periodicals, which I'm happy to sort of discuss in the Q&A if anyone is interested. The library started systematically collecting newspapers in 1822, and these were passed on from the Stamp Office after 2 years. So the librarian at the time came to an arrangement with the Stamp Office that when they had kept hold of newspapers for the required 2 years, in case they were needed for prosecution, they would then be passed on to the British Library. And so the earliest years we have from that arrangement are 1819. And this arrangement continued until legal deposit was established in 1869. But I'm starting to notice there are actually some gaps in our collection from the late 1850s through to the mid 1860s, which is the period after the stamp duty was revoked and before legal deposit came in. So in general, we have newspapers from that period, but I'm starting to notice that there are a few that were founded in that period that seem to have not been collected. So that's something that I'm hoping to dig into over the next few years and work out if there's any way of filling some of those gaps. We have over 37,000 unique titles and more than 60 million issues within our collection. Our newspapers are also collected on microfilm, and we have access to digital newspapers via online databases, including the British Newspaper Archive, which is a partnership between us and Find My Past. Okay. Has that one worked? Next slide. Yeah. Okay, good. Going a bit more quickly now. So the library was originally part of the British Museum, and newspapers had their own reading room at the museum. However, the space that newspapers were taking up started to cause problems in the late 19th century. And in 1905, the majority of newspapers were moved to Colindale for storage. And then a reading room opened there in 1932. They stayed there until 2011, when the poor preservation conditions and the lack of storage expansion space meant that they needed to be moved again. And I know many of you will have experienced Colindale. And we're still dealing with some of the slightly strange sort of hangovers from the time when newspapers were there and were separate from the main British Library. So after 2011, a new storage building was opened up at Boston Spa, and a new reading room at St Pancras was opened, which I'm sure many of you have visited. The new building that was built to house the collection is up in Boston Spa, which is in Yorkshire. And it's called the National Newspaper Building, or we call it the NNB. It's a high density storage building, which is temperature controlled and low oxygen. Newspapers are stored in crates and retrieved electronically by robot arms, and it's very, very cool. And if anyone is interested in seeing how that works, if you Google the National Newspaper Building, there's several videos on YouTube, and they're really fun to watch. They at one point managed to get a camera onto one of the crates that they were retrieving, and you can kind of see the whole process of it being moved around. And in general, I say the National Newspaper Building is wonderful. It's a really, really great facility, and it's a great way of storing newspapers. However, it does present its own challenge, which, if you can see this map, the dot at the bottom is where I work, and the dot at the top is where the newspapers are kept. So that's, yeah, it's a long journey. I know for any users, if you order newspapers, it takes 48 hours for them to arrive, and that's actually the same for curators. So if we want to look at something that's stored at the National Newspaper Building, we have to wait for it to be delivered the same as anyone else. So occasionally that can sort of cause problems. Usually it's when we have the press wanting to use something and they want it immediately. They phone up and say, can we use something tomorrow? And we have to generally say, no, not unless we can do something really, really magically. So it presents some problems, and it does mean we can't just go and walk and look at the shelves like they did in the days when things were at Colindale. So now I'm going to talk about my job. And a lot of time I get asked about what a day in my job involves, and it's quite hard to describe because every day is different. I have one dedicated member of staff who works alongside me on newspapers, and her name is Claire O'Halloran, and she's been the curator of newspaper collections for the last 2 years, and we work together closely on much of the work. I should say this is a picture of my old desk. It's now where Claire sits, but my current desk is so messy that I was too embarrassed to take a picture of it. So this is how I would like it to look, but most of the time it doesn't. Most days I spend dealing with some inquiries. We have an incredibly knowledgeable specialist news reference team who are based in the newsroom, and many of you will have encountered. And they know so much that we tend to only get passed on the most complicated of inquiries. So things that are going to take a long time, things that need in-depth digging, anything very research-based, or things that have stumped the newsroom team. And in general, if it stumped them, it's probably going to be a bit of a challenge for us to come up with anything either, because a lot of them have worked at the library for a long time and they know a lot about newspapers. But we do get passed on some inquiries, and I'm always excited when I see an inquiry passed on from someone from RSVP. I attend a lot of meetings about strategy, finance, preservation, outreach, and technology. I attend meetings with peer organisations, so other libraries around the country and across the world. And I spend a lot of time in meetings about digitization, both in-house and with our various partners. And digitization is something that I will come back to later. I do a lot of work around collection management, including storage, acquisitions, preservation, processing, and cataloguing. And any of you who've used the library recently will know we've got a new catalogue. And while it's very exciting, it's also very different. And so I've been spending quite a lot of time trying to get up to speed with what that means for newspapers, and working out the things that have transferred over well and the things that need tweaking now that they're on a different system. I also provide research support to readers and to projects that we support or are partnered with. I supervise collaborative PhD students. I've just finished supervising Matthew Stevens, who's probably on the call here somewhere. And I've got a new PhD who's recently started. And I also organise and supervise 3-month PhD placements. And I have one on illustrated newspapers that's just about to be advertised. So those of you in the UK with PhD students, keep your eyes peeled for that. It should be coming out, I think, maybe next week. It's quite exciting when we have people who come in and are able to sort of work directly with the collection, doing research, and it's always nice to supervise and support them. My team do a lot of outreach work, such as writing blogs or helping make content for our social media team. We organise visits, show and tells, and talks for researchers, community groups, schools and universities, peer organisations, and colleagues from across the library. And we also work on exhibitions and help support exhibitions that are organised by other people, whether that's in-house, where we've just got 1 or 2 newspapers within an exhibition, or whether it's going through the process of loaning items to other exhibitions at museums and libraries around the country. And sometimes I even manage to scrape together a bit of time to do some research. We are supposed to be research active at the library, but that is obviously the thing that always gets pushed down the agenda. So it's always exciting when I do get a bit of time to do that. And while the outreach and the research and the networking and all those bits of my work are incredibly exciting, most of my days actually look more like this. I have so many spreadsheets, tracking digitization projects, keeping track of preservation work, tracking locations and cataloguing, and all the other many day-to-day activities. And I think if you told my 16-year-old self that the majority of my day would be spent on spreadsheets, I would have been horrified. But I think that's probably most jobs these days. And it is very satisfying when you've got a good spreadsheet that does actually tell you something useful. Right, moving on to conservation and preservation, which is probably going to take up quite a bit of the rest of this talk, because it's something that's very much on my mind at the moment. And it's definitely a huge challenge at the moment. The condition of the newspapers in our collection varies greatly. We have many imperfect or very good condition, but we also have a lot that are in a condition that means that they're currently inaccessible to users. We assign our newspapers one of 3 conditions. So they can be good, which means exactly what it says, and it means that we don't worry about them too much. We have poor, which means that we check them every time they are used for anything. So if anyone looks at them, or if they come up for conservation, for digitization, we keep a really close eye on them to see that they're not degrading any further. And we have unfit, which basically means that they're not fit to be used. And this also means that they're blocked from ordering. So that'll be the thing, it will say in the catalogue that these items are too fragile to use. We do allow people to, via the reference team, to fill in a form to say that they would like to see something, even if it isn't fit. And then myself or Claire are responsible for doing a condition check on the item and seeing whether we think it can be used. And we're far more likely to do that if somebody wants to look at a specific page that we can assess whether, even if the binding's loose, or the text block has come away, or there's some reason why we normally wouldn't let people look at it. If somebody wants to look at a specific page and we can get it set up open to that page for them to come and see, that's far more likely to be allowed than somebody who wants to leaf through. So that's something worth bearing in mind if you do ever get told that something is unfit. We have many of the same preservation issues with our material as other collections. So we have volumes that have got loose boards, loose or missing boards, things that are degrading, tight bindings. We have items with loose or ripped pages. We have things that have been torn. We have things that have been defaced or damaged. And the biggest issue that we really face at the moment with our collection, and which is unique to newspapers and to some periodicals, is newsprint, which is, I would say, the biggest challenge that I am currently facing. Yes, it's the bane of my life in many ways. So newsprint is a type of cheap paper made from wood pulp, which was first adopted for newspapers in the 1840s. And because of the process of producing it was quick and, well, was and is quick and cheap, various compounds that naturally occur in wood are left in the paper when it's produced, making the paper prone to yellowing and becoming brittle. The vast majority of our post-1840 newspaper collection is printed on newsprint, and this makes them very difficult to look after. This is particularly true for anything in the late 19th and early to mid 20th century. The paper is degrading, and as it does so, it releases gases which further speed up the process of degradation. And in recent talks with conservators, we've sort of discovered how little there is that we can do about this. There aren't any current recognised processes for preventing this degradation. There isn't a way of stopping the paper from breaking down that doesn't do some damage in its own right. We can slow it down, usually by storing the newspapers in the best conditions possible. So the National Newspaper Building is a key factor in how we look after these newsprint newspapers. However, it was also raised with us that newspapers in bound volumes are at a higher risk because the bindings can create an environment that traps the gases produced and speeds up the process of the breakdown of the paper. So we've been having serious conversations and discussions about the process of disbinding. With the scale of the collection, this isn't going to be something that is done quickly or in large numbers, but we may target some items that are in very bad condition or are unique to our holdings. And considering the fact that this is something that we often talk about at RSVP and in discussions around periodical history, we discuss the changes that come about when a periodical is bound into a volume. I thought I'd throw out the question of how people feel about the idea of something being disbound, and what that does to our understanding of what constitutes a Victorian periodical, and particularly something that has been bound and then disbound. So I thought I'd throw that out there, and maybe it's something that we can discuss at the end. So besides disbinding, there are many other things that we can do for the collection to preserve it as best we can. Storing items in the National Newspaper Building is one of them. Our surrogate first policy is another. This means that if an item is available via a surrogate, so either microfilm or digital, then the hard copy will be blocked from ordering. This means that there's less handling and there's less exposure to unideal conditions. Again, we do allow people to request to order an item, even if it is blocked on the catalogue because it's got a surrogate, and you would do that via the reference team. And the one thing you have to do then is justify why you need to see the hard copy. And this might apply to a lot of you because a lot of the requests we get and a lot of the requests we allow are because people want to look at the materiality of the item. So looking at paper quality, color or size. If we do get these requests through for someone to look at something that's been blocked because it's surrogated, then what we tend to do, it comes to me, I make a decision of whether I think it's a good reason why somebody wants to look at it and whether they actually need to see the hard copy. We do a condition check. And as long as it's a good reason to see it, and as long as it is in a good enough condition, we will allow you to see that item. Where appropriate, particularly for our pre-1840s newspapers that aren't on newsprint, we get volumes rebound or bindings repaired. We have items boxed in special conservation grade boxes where necessary, and this is particularly important for loose or crumbling items. And finally, digitization. This is our main focus for preservation going forwards, as it creates surrogate copies that are easily accessible. And so finally, to go on to talk about digitization, the British Library is involved in large-scale newspaper digitization. We mostly do this with a series of partners. Some of them are academic partners, such as Gale Cengage, Adam Matthew, and ProQuest, but we also do a great deal with family history companies such as Ancestry and MyHeritage. Our biggest partnership is with Find My Past in creating the British Newspaper Archive, and they are just about to reach their 100 millionth page next month. So obviously this does mean a huge amount of material is available. It's available free if you're at the British Library. And we also work with them to make a certain amount of material free to view every year. And for some of these partnerships, me and my team are actively involved with selection of material that's digitized, but for most of them, we just check that the material is suitable, that it's in good enough condition, and that there aren't any restrictions preventing digitization. We have studios both at Boston Spa and at St Pancras that are involved in digitization, and some of our partners have their own on-site studios, such as Find My Past and Gale. They both have their own studios. And this digitization can involve a flatbed scanner like the one shown here. It can involve photography using cameras, and there's also scanners that are specially designed to scan from microfilm. They're probably the most widely used ones for newspapers because we have a large amount of our newspapers on microfilm, and it is so much faster to scan from that. But we're trying to balance up with all of our partners the need for getting as much content as possible online, but also the preservation needs of creating a surrogate. And if we've already got a microfilm, then scanning from the microfilm doesn't create a new, like it creates a surrogate of a surrogate. And so we're trying to make sure a certain amount is scanned from hard copy every year, and particularly focusing on collections that are otherwise unavailable. The library does undertake some of its own digitization projects, though funding for these isn't as available I was involved in the selection, in disambiguation of titles, in condition checking, in checking issues around copyright, and in producing and monitoring the workflows necessary to get newspaper volumes to and from our digitization studios. One of the biggest things I learned from working on that project is how challenging the newspaper formats can be. So the middle image here is the sort of, so it's a variation in size of items that we are dealing with. And we frequently ran up against the challenge of multi-title volumes, and I've sort of got a couple of examples on the slide as well of those. And I'm sure many of you have also encountered either a multi-title volume or the wonderful miscellaneous volumes, which I always like when I'm researching, but when you're trying to digitize, it's one of the worst things you can see, actually, because you're run up against some sort of interesting issues around how you should approach those in sort of decision making around a multi-title volume, because you may have pulled out that volume to digitize a specific title, but then should you be digitizing every title that is in that volume? And if you start doing that, it can quickly sort of get out of hand, and you find that you go to another volume to do some more of that title, and that's also a multi-title volume with new titles in, and you can just find that it gets bigger and bigger as a project. So we had to juggle that quite a lot, and it can quickly escalate to being dozens and dozens more titles than you'd originally signed up to do. It also makes workflows quite complicated, particularly because it's not always clear from the catalogue which things are in volumes with each other. Actually, the new catalogue that's come online has made that a bit clearer. You can see more now that things are bound in together. But it can mean that when you're trying to work through digitization, a volume goes to and from the digitization studio several times to digitize different titles. And obviously that isn't ideal and it isn't efficient. But we never really found a way to work around that. It may be something for future projects that I have to spend a bit of time thinking about before we start. And that's it. I'm hoping you've got loads of questions and that I can answer most of them. As I always say, if you are at the British Library at any point, do drop me a line. I'm always happy to catch up with people who are doing research. Love going for a coffee when you're there. I've learned it's dangerous because that's how you get signed up to do things like this. But yeah, thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Beth. I wonder, would you like to keep your slides up during the Q&A, or do you want to see people's faces? What would be better?
I might see people's faces, so I'll stop sharing.
Okay. Well, that was amazing. I can't wait to keep talking about it. I know there are some questions in the chat that kind of popped in as you were going through your talk, so we could start with those, but if anyone wants to unmute or raise their hand, please feel free. Maybe here, I'll start. This is a question from Claire that came up in the chat when you were talking about how bound newsprint volumes might degrade all the more quickly. Claire asked, so does this degradation become a motivator for investment in further digitization?
Yes, it does. The problem with that is that it's at such a large scale because so many of the newspapers are on newsprint that it's kind of terrifying, and it's something that's come to the fore quite recently that there really isn't a huge amount else that we can do. So we're definitely trying to put together a lot of schemes at the moment to prioritize things that we have identified as degrading quite quickly. We've always got a list of those. We've got a list every time something comes up and we're particularly worried about it, we add it onto a list to be like, is this something that we'll need prioritizing for digitization? There isn't a huge amount of funding for it. We have to bid every year for funding for preservation, and we're up against all of the other departments at the library. But it does help that we have workflows in place already for digitization. The costs for us digitizing stuff isn't necessarily as high as it would be for some of the other departments. But yeah, it's definitely something that has come to be a priority in my mind. And so over the next few years, I'm going to try and make sure that I'm pushing through particularly things that are getting requested a lot that I can see are becoming really crumbly. And we're also going to be doing a lot more boxing, I think. But yeah, it's certainly an impetus to get digitizing more and to try and digitize more from the hard copy. And also our conservation team, while they can't do a lot to stop the degradation other than kind of storing, we can store it really well. One of the things they can do is do some repairs that make the newspaper suitable for digitization. So they can sort of do repairs that will hold it together enough that it can be digitized. And obviously for those items, they're digitized very carefully so as not to cause any more damage.
Thanks, Beth.
And then Lars, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
I mean, I've noticed that Paul's asked a much more interesting question in the chat, which Beth might want to answer first. No, I was just going to go back to this question of categorization. I mean, you mentioned the miscellaneous volumes, but also newspapers and periodicals, and how that's aggregated or disaggregated within the collections? Are there different, I mean, workflows? Are there different digitization programs?
Yes,
Yeah.
is the answer. Yeah, the categorization one is really interesting and at times a bit frustrating. And it actually goes back to British Museum days, in that um, there was always a kind of categorization of newspapers, and then there was kind of journals and periodicals. But when they decided that there wasn't enough room for the newspapers at the British Museum and they shipped them out to Colindale, a decision was also made to ship out all of the non academic, non highbrow journals, and so all of the weeklies pretty much went, and a lot of the monthlies went as well. Anything to do with trade, anything that was sort of classified as a magazine went to Colindale, and the quarterlies and the highbrow journals and things like the Times and the Illustrated London News were kept at the British Museum. And at various points for some of those titles, they ended up with two copies. Split. So like the Times we have multiple copies of, because there was one at the British Museum and one at Colindale, and then there was one that was a reading copy and one which was a storage copy. But when they decided to move it out of Colindale, there was a decision to split them again, but split them differently, and they decided it would be done by periodical or journal and newspaper. And there was decisions that were made along the lines of daily, how frequent it was. So dailies all went into newspapers, monthlies and quarterlies all went into the periodicals collection, and it's the weeklies that have become the sort of sticking point. And there were some decisions made around how much news they contained, whether they contained a place name in their title. And so
Okay.
some of the time you can really see why those decisions were made. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Luckily, we've got a really good relationship with our colleagues in Printed Heritage, who look after the journals and the periodicals. And there is a good understanding of like where the expertise lies for various things. This is complicated more by things like the miscellaneous volumes, because within a miscellaneous volume, you might have something now that is categorized as a periodical next to something that is categorized as a newspaper. So that obviously causes mayhem. In general, the workflows for digitization are the same, particularly if it's being done by one of our external partners. Although, like Find My Past, they were given a kind of cut of our catalogue, which they could select from when they first started digitizing, which was the newspapers and periodicals held at Colindale. So they've then got this weird distinction that doesn't quite fit with how the library is now arranged. And the money for when we're bidding for preservation via digitization sits with two different departments. And again, that's obviously very complicated because sometimes it might be one volume with things. So it's complicated, and I am doing some work to try to detangle it. And it's going quite well in terms of that we've got a much stronger relationship, where we talk a lot more about the crossovers between our collections. But yeah, it seems to have been a problem right since the library first started collecting periodicals and newspapers. So I suspect it's one that's never going to be resolved entirely to everyone's.
It's really interesting because it's a lot of those hierarchies that we in periodical studies are quite committed to dismantling, isn't it?
Yes.
But are kind of institutionalized. So yeah, really
Yeah.
interesting to hear your insight on that. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. There's been sort of a delightful torrent of questions in the chat, so I'll maybe start going through them. This question's from Paul Fife. He says, has the BL and or its partners been employing ML AI for OCR and potentially for other forms of cataloging, description analysis, etc.? Basically, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on AI in cultural heritage institutions.
Ooh, tricky one. There's certainly been a lot of people looking at this. I think a lot of the partners are looking at how AI could be used. I've definitely seen some examples where AI has been used to do OCR better than the OCR has previously been done. So I think there's a lot of work going on around that. I think there's also quite a lot of caution around it. The British Library is currently working on an AI policy. So I have colleagues within the library that are working on that. Yeah, it's definitely one that's up in the air at the moment. So I think some ways watch this space. A lot of the partners are trying to do very interesting things, but I think there has also been some examples where it really hasn't worked. And it's quite interesting because some of the partners and some people at the library have been playing around with using AI, but with sort of the corpus is just made up of newspapers from the library or newspapers that have been digitized by the partner. So you've got a very controlled corpus. So the results, therefore, should be more reliable. But I think it's still very much a work in progress. A lot is being done around OCR generally at the moment, looking at how to improve it. I know lots of people are working on things to improve zoning. And so there's kind of lots of stuff is happening, but I don't feel like any of it's really settled yet. So yeah, there's probably people at the library who could say a lot more about this than I can at the moment. But I suspect over the next year or two, there's going to be quite a lot of talk, and I think potentially some papers given by people within our digital scholarship team in particular that might speak to that question.
Thank you. All right, I guess I'll feed another one that came up in the chat as you were speaking. This one's from Andrew King. It's two related questions. The first one, the prospect of disbinding was a shock from the POV of users. What would be the effect in the catalog and for ordering? And then the part two of that is, are you planning on setting up a user group for catalog entries on newspapers and periodicals and for a system for user discovered updates? In fact, is there already a system for providing more accurate updates to the catalog?
Okay, I'll start at the end there. No, there isn't currently a system for providing updates to the catalogue, but there is quite a lot of work being done to look at that at the moment because we have our new catalogue. Yeah, I think, I don't know whether there is ever going to be a way that there can be things provided. Yeah, I don't know how that feedback will work back, and it wouldn't come directly through me. There's lots of people who work on the catalogue. It would be interesting. Maybe I need to ask a question about whether we're ever going to move to having more sort of user input onto that. In terms of just binding and how that would affect the catalogue, that's a very good question and something I'm kind of still grappling with. We would have to do it in such a way that, meant that the item became more accessible rather than less, I think. Like ideally, if we disbind, that would mean that we could then offer access to issues within that volume that are in good condition, even if not all of them are. So previously, if a volume had been taken out of circulation because what we normally find is it's the issues at the front of a volume that are in the worst condition, and actually once you get to the middle of a text block, they tend to be much better. They've been protected by the rest of the text block around them. So if we disbound, obviously that would mean that we might be able to offer access to the later issues within a volume that were previously blocked. I don't yet know. It may we're having discussions about whether we would have to I think we probably would have to individually create individual item records for each issue rather than just having it at a volume level. And that's obviously a lot of work, which is one of the reasons why this might be quite a slow process. At the moment, if you order current newspapers, they come in boxes, and the box has a list at the front of it of all the issues that are contained within, and they check them as you take them out, and they check them as they give them back in to make sure that they're all there, but they aren't actually individually barcoded or catalogued down to issue level. So that's another option. But obviously, that makes me quite nervous. So it's something I'm still thinking about. And if we do start seriously considering doing the disbinding, it's something that I'm going to have to speak to a lot of people around the library about. So people in collection security and people in metadata services, to find out how do we do this and make sure that we make more things accessible without making them more a danger of being taken or getting damaged. So good questions, Andrew, and maybe one day I'll have full answers, but they're the kind of questions I'm actually asking at the moment.
And then the next question in the chat's from Linda Hughes. She says, you mentioned research when you're lucky enough to have some time for it. What are you researching right now?
Oh God, many things. I'm still working on some stuff around the military periodicals. That's what I did my PhD on. I've got some idea that one day my PhD will turn into a book, but that I want to have some time for that. I'm working on some stuff on primary sources on 19th century journalism, and I do also keep pulling together stuff, and doing talks like this helps. One day I want to write a book on newspaper collecting in Britain that covers how newspapers have been collected, where they've been collected, why, what survived, what hasn't. That's a big project. I think it's likely to be one that the British Library would be happy for me to do and might publish themselves. But I think about it a lot. I don't actually get anywhere doing it. But like I say, things like talks like this, I start pulling together the information. I've got quite a lot of information on the history of the British Library, but I would also like to, find out for all the other legal deposit libraries, any other libraries, any other special collections. There might be a lifetime's work in that, so I don't know.
I don't know if you could see as you were describing your kind of dream book, there was this explosion of, thumbs
Yeah,
ups and hearts and applause. So, um, as far as crowdsourcing goes, I think you can call that pitch really successful. That sounds
yeah.
fascinating.
So one day I'll find
Um,
time.
all right, so I'll keep going to the chat, and I'm happy to keep reading through the chat. You all are also, I just want to reiterate, you're also welcome to unmute if you prefer to talk through your question, but I'm happy to keep reading. So this one's from Josh Powell. He says, you mentioned the extensive knowledge of a specialist news reference team. As a new PhD candidate researching 19th century newspapers, I was wondering what sort of things they're able to help with.
They know a lot about our collection. So they'll be able to help you find things, they'll be able to help you use the catalogue. And that goes for everyone now. We've got the new catalogue. They have had lots of training and are very practiced already in helping people to navigate the new catalogue. They will log any issues you find, things that don't work. But as a new PhD, they're very knowledgeable about what we have in our collection. So that's the newspapers that we hold, but also all the secondary material that we have on newspaper history, and any databases that we have that give you additional access to material, whether that's digitized newspapers or sources around circulation figures, or any of those type of things. They know a lot. They've got this amazing document that they've been producing over the years. Every time someone asks a question and they have to look it up and find the answer, they write it down. And I only discovered this a couple of years ago, and it's like the best thing I've ever seen. It's got things in it on like when was the first crossword that appeared in a newspaper, those kind of things. They get asked it once, they write it down once they've discovered the answer. So they're very, very knowledgeable. They've most of them have been working at the library a lot longer than I have. Some of them worked back in the days at Colindale, so they kind of understand the weird and wonderful ways that the collection has developed and worked. And they will also sometimes be able to explain why things are a little bit odd. And usually that's got to do with the fact that Colindale was a separate library and it's been merged into the main British Library, and there's still some strange foibles left over from that. But they're also really friendly. So if in doubt, if you've got any uncertainties or any questions, you can always go and speak to them. And if they don't know, they'll refer it up to me. And then I'll probably say, if you don't know, I don't know whether I know either. But I have a bit more time to sort of dig into things, particularly if it's to do with, we get a lot where people can't quite understand why we've got certain things and not other things, or people questioning title changes and things like that. That tends to be where I get involved, start digging in amongst Waterloo and all the other sources that we have to work out what's going on.
Thank you. And then, Prithvi, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. I didn't know if you were going through the questions and chat. But thanks, Beth. Wonderful to see you and see so many people here. I know you said at the start that your particular focus is on British and Irish periodicals, but in some way, I wonder if my question is sort of picking up on something Lars mentioned and some of these other threads I'm seeing. I'm trying to merge things about that Andrew raised about user and bringing in, and in a way I'm thinking in terms of RSVP. I mean, we are this community of people who work so much on periodicals and newspapers, and um, one of the directions that, of course, this community has gone and is to expand from British and Irish, to think of British and Irish as a larger non-geographic entity, right? We can do the Anglosphere with the colonies, et cetera, et cetera. And my question is how is that conceptual broadening or widening, as it's been called, happening in the BL sort of, I mean, I've talked to you, right? I work on Indian newspapers. I have no idea where because, this has to do with the India office getting subsumed by the BL, and that is a very murky story. But I guess my larger question is that conceptual one, right? How is the kind of work that we as scholars are doing shifting or shaping or reshaping these geographic borders that have kept things a little bit more tidy and ordered. So, I mean, Linda, who uses yours, going to make it even more unmanageable, but it is an access question for some of us. So, thanks.
Yes. It's an interesting one, and it's one that I'm still kind of working out. I've been in the library 8 years, and I'm still sometimes trying to work out which department certain bits of the library, the newspapers collection sits with. And we have newspapers that sit in most of the other collection areas. So whether that's the Eccles Centre looks after American collections, but only American collections post 1850. So anything before that falls into my area. Loads of the 18th century overseas newspapers also sit with me, interestingly. And colonial newspapers are potentially the most complicated. It's most straightforward where newspapers are if they're in another language, they sit with whichever curator is in charge of the collection that looks after that language. But if they're in English, the boundaries are less clear, and sometimes they sit with me and sometimes they sit with one of the departments. The India office newspapers don't sit with me. They sit with the Asian African team. However, one of the big things that I have been doing is trying to make the connections with those curators and say, have you got newspapers in your collection? Or I know you've got newspapers in your collection. Do you know about them? What do you know about them? And what I'm trying to do is, the British Library can be quite siloed, and I'm trying to work. And I think actually a lot of the curators at the library now are trying to work to break down those silos and recognise that people don't work in that way generally, and it doesn't. It also people can at times be quite protective of their collection area. But I think, again, the conversations I'm having at the moment seem to be much more about, okay, well, I look after this thing, but that doesn't mean that, I can't talk to people about it and I can't have discussions. So I think what is happening more and more is that we're recognizing that if someone comes in with an inquiry about an Indian newspaper, you might go to one curator, but they're much more open to speaking to people and being like, well, I don't actually know that much about newspaper history, so maybe I need to go and talk to one of my colleagues, and then we work together on it rather than sitting in these tight silos. So I'm hoping that helps. Who knows, maybe there'll be a big reorganization of the library at some point and they'll move all the newspapers together, but I think that's very unlikely. And there's always going to be boundaries, and I kind of have moments where I'm like, could this be done better? And then I always run up against something where I'm like, well, I don't know that I want to be looking in charge of the Russian newspapers because I can't read them. So yeah, I think that the library has become a lot better recently about working across collections and across formats and across teams, and so hopefully that supports the kind of scholarship that also does that. I hope that answers a bit.
Thanks. The next question is from Whitney Thompson in the chat. They say, do you know if there are any plans in the near or less near future to digitize News of the World from its microfilm? I could be wrong about this, but it seems like it's one of the last big London titles from the long 19th century, if not the last. And I suspect I'm not the only one who spent a chunk of time speed reading microfilm, and ergo would love a full text searchable version.
There are no plans to digitize News of the World because because it's a problematic title. We have some issues around copyright in newspapers in that while officially the copyright is the same for newspapers as for everything else, so it's 70 years after the death of the author, one, there's a problem in that a lot of them are anonymously written. So finding the author can be quite difficult, and you have to do due diligence to prove that you can't find the author. And a lot of the time, the person who knows is the publisher, and they sometimes will just say that they know who it is and then won't tell us, so we can't trace it. There's also an argument made by a lot of newspaper publishers that their newspapers that are still continuing to be published remain in copyright as long as that newspaper continues to be published. And it would be on the library to prove otherwise. So we would have to prove that the copyright doesn't exist rather than them having to prove that it does. And so in general, we steer away from anything that's still in publication. We are quite careful about titles that may have ceased, but who published up into the copyright period. And any newspapers that are published by certain publishers that are not happy about their newspapers being digitized. So, and obviously the News of the World is a particularly difficult one. So at present, there are no plans to digitize it, and I can't say that there ever will be. I would like to say that maybe one day there will be, but yeah, sorry about that one. Yeah, it's well recognized that it is the one that isn't. We're all aware of it, and at this point in time, there's very little we can do about that.
It's interesting to hear you talk about this periodical as this sort of specter that's like haunting the digitization of 19th century papers a little bit.
Yeah.
The next question in the chat is from Isabel. She says, I have a question about the quality checks involved in digitizing. There have been many instances where I've accessed a newspaper online in digitized format, but I can't read the whole article because the page on either side is blurred because the newspaper must not have laid flat while it was being copied or digitized. This makes me wonder how much the digitized pages are checked by the actual humans for completeness / high quality before being made available online, and whether or how this issue is being recognized and addressed within newspaper conservation.
Yes, it's something that we have noticed. Sometimes this depends on where, well, first of all, how the newspaper has been digitized. If it's been digitized from hard copy, that's less likely to happen. But it can very much depend on the binding of the newspaper. If you've got a very tight binding, it's very hard to digitize right into the gutter, and so you can lose the edge of pages quite a lot. On some of the digitization projects I've worked on, there has been a loosening of the binding by conservation to allow for that, but it has to be done very carefully because that can cause more damage to the volume. There's also some of the digitization is done from British Library microfilm, which was done to a certain standard, and some of it, particularly if you're looking at more modern newspapers, has been done from publisher microfilm, which I have discovered tends to be less good quality. It is recognized. It's always worth flagging if there's a particularly bad example to the platform that the newspaper is on, just to say that it's bad. And particularly if a lot of people do that, it might be that they then look at that and say, okay, we maybe need to go back and look at this. It was something when I worked on Heritage Made Digital newspapers that we really focused on, was how to get the best picture of each page that we could. But that obviously takes a lot of time and it's slow and expensive. And so a lot of our partners, particularly the family history partners, there's a definite sense of they want to get a lot of pages up, and they're less concerned about the quality than the quantity. I have mixed feelings about that because it does mean they get huge amounts of material online in a way that we never could do if we were doing really sort of in-depth quality checking. But it does mean that there are instances you encounter where it's almost unusable. if anyone does encounter that, well, like I say, the best thing to do is to flag it to the platform. You can always flag it to me, particularly if it's on the British Newspaper Archive, and I can see if I can do anything. But if you flag it to me, I will have to send it to the to find my past. So sometimes it's best to go direct. But yeah, it is something that I've noticed. I'd like to think it's not very frequent, but I've definitely noticed there's a few titles where there's a lot of it isn't as good quality as I would like. And yeah, the ideal thing would be that we did all of it from hard copy and did it really beautifully. Yeah, got the bindings relaxed where they needed to be. Got a really full page. Occasionally, the other thing you can find is I've had a few where I've been looking at various databases and gone, that's really, really bad image. And then I've called up the newspaper and it's in really, really bad condition. And actually what they've captured is exactly how the page looks. And it's just unfortunate that there's the sections of the page missing, or it's been laminated by conservators in the past in a way that means it's nearly illegible. So it's not always down to the capture process, but it usually is.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one or maybe two more questions coming out of the chat. So we have one here from Peter. He says, in the National Newspaper Building, there's low oxygen level in the newspaper storage rooms. Is that for preservation reasons? And if so, should this be used for books in the same period also, or is the paper of those printed books less vulnerable than the newsprint?
It is done for preservation. And yes, ideally, I think everything would be stored like that. I think there was a priority was given to newspapers in a way because newsprint is particularly bad. But we already have one other high density storage building at Boston Spa, which is for books and journals, and they are stored in the same conditions. And they're currently building another high density storage building, which is the same. So more and more of the collection is getting stored within those kind of conditions. They're designed to be kind of the optimal preservation conditions. So they've got the right humidity and they've got the right temperature and they've got the low oxygen, which is how you would like to store paper generally.
All right, I think this will be our last question, but it's probably, I think, quite a perfect one to end on. It's also from Peter. He says, Arthur de Wedderman, sorry, and Arthur Pedegee have done a lot of work on newspapers that don't exist anymore. Can you estimate what percentage is missing in your collection at the BL?
No. My predecessor, Luke McKernan, who some of you may have met, had some great idea when I first started that what we should do is create a list of all the newspapers ever produced and then go through and work out what we had. And I had to spend quite a lot of time explaining to him that no list of what all the newspapers existed. We did some things where we tried to pull some things together from lists from the Stamp Office and various places. But until someone produces a list of all the newspapers that were produced, we do have a list of everything that we hold. So we can obviously compare the two, but we don't have the list of everything. So we have very good collections from 1869 onwards. Not completely comprehensive, but fairly comprehensive. Before that, they're much patchier. And even today, there still are gaps. We have a big gap during COVID from newspapers that weren't sent for legal deposit. And so that's something that's being worked on. I have no idea what the percentage is. And yeah, if somebody wants to produce a list of all the newspapers ever made, I can provide the list of what the British Library holds, and then we can compare. But yeah, I'm afraid I don't have any sense of what those two things would look like.
Thank you. So we're out of time, so we're going to wrap up here. Allison's put the details for our next Digi event in February. It's on the 27th, so you can mark that in your calendars. But thank you again to Beth so much for such a great talk.
Thank you for having me.
And we hope to see you all again in February.